Hello, DC fans! Today we're going to take a look at the question of when does Superman happen in the DCU timeline. So, there will be spoilers for the movie, but as long as you're okay with that, then let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget we have a July contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, and you could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And we have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out in case you're interested. Plus, hang around to the end of the video, and we'll talk about the Doomsday Watch on the Discord. Okay, so let's start off by looking at what is canon in the new DCU. In fact, Gunn was asked that in an interview. A lot of people are wondering what's canon in the new DC. And he said, it's whatever we mention in anything, and kind of laughs. But then he gives a better answer. He says, Peacemaker is pretty easy. Peacemaker Season 1 is basically canon outside of the appearance of the Justice League at the end, which you'll see something about that in Peacemaker Season 2. Then he says Suicide Squad is probably a little looser. We know that Rick Flag Sr. is angry because his son was killed by Peacemaker, so we know that situation happened in the past. And then this is the key. But that exists as canon because it was mentioned in Creature Commandos, not necessarily because it existed in Suicide Squad. I think of Suicide Squad and Peacemaker as pretty unreliable memories of what happened in the DCU. And in fact, Gunn has doubled down on that in recent interviews, saying only Creature Commandos Forward is pure canon, Peacemaker is almost entirely consistent with that canon, other than the Justice League, and Suicide Squad has a lot of consistencies, but I think of it as an imperfect memory. So basically, Gunn is saying these four movies and shows are canon to the DCU. Basically, Suicide Squad and Peacemaker being loose canon, and Creature Commandos and Superman being 100% canon. Now, I always get asked, but what about Blue Beetle? So the only thing I've seen Gunn say about it is that Blue Beetle exists in the DCU, but the movie may not be canon to the DCU. So we're going to kind of have to wait and see whether things from that movie get mentioned at a later point in time. Okay, so let's try to put some of these on the timeline with the information that we have. So when does the Suicide Squad happen? Now, keep in mind, this is an interview by Gunn when the movie first came out and was part of the DCEU, but he said it takes place in the year when it comes out. So it came out August of 2021, so presumably that's when it happened. In fact, he doubled down on that when asked, is Suicide Squad after Birds of Prey? So you can see they're still talking DCEU at this point. And he said the Suicide Squad takes place in the year it comes out. Okay, great, that's helpful. However, in the movie itself, when Harley's being tortured, the executioner is texting, and in particular, if you kind of have to move your device around until you can read it, it's really hard to catch. But the date there translates to Monday, August 17th of 2020. All right, so Gunn said August of 2021. This text inside the movie seems to say August of 2020. And then there's yet a third possibility. So the prison record for Harley Quinn, and this is a prop, mind you, which didn't really show up in the movie, so there, you always got to take those with a grain of salt. But notice, her date of birth is December of 1992, and she's 29. So that means the movie couldn't possibly take place any earlier than December of 2021. Okay, so that gives us three possible times when this movie could take place. Also, it is worth giving a shout out to the future director, Florence Crawley, because you remember when Amanda Waller goes nutso at the end of the Suicide Squad? Well, it's Crawley that bangs her on the head, and she makes an appearance in Superman. Isn't that awesome? And now she is Director Crawley. So basically, when Lex went to get permission to arrest Superman, he had to talk to her. So she definitely got a big promotion. Okay, so let's put what we know about the Suicide Squad. It could be August 2020, August 2021, or sometime after December of 2021. All right, how about Peacemaker? Well, Peacemaker's a little more clear. Peacemaker himself said that he was laid out in the hospital for 5 months. Basically, that's after, he got so injured during the Suicide Squad. Okay, now granted, he says 5 months, but the fact that he said 5 makes me think we can probably rely on this. All right, it's also worth noting that Economos breaks his leg. Remember, we even see him on crutches. You'll see why I'm bringing that up in a minute. So, all right, this one's a lot easier. It's 5 months after the Suicide Squad, and we see Economos has a broken leg at the end of the series. Okay, so now on to Creature Commandos, which is the first fully canon entry in the DCU. And remember, Gunn said anything that's mentioned in Creature Commandos or Superman makes it canon. So when Rick Flag Sr. talks about the fact that Congress put a stop to all Task Force X activities after your daughter outed you, that makes this scene from Peacemaker Season 1 canon. Very cool. Also, it's mentioned that Weasel was in the Suicide Squad. It's one of the few soldiers still alive from Project Starfish. In fact, here we see him after he got out of the water from almost drowning. And in fact, speaking of that, Rick Flag Sr. says supposedly he had a bad experience the last trip he took on this Osprey, which was one of my favorite parts of the movie, right? When Rick Flag Jr. is like, did anyone check whether Weasel could swim? Oh my, that was awesome. That was awesome. All right, we also see that Rick Flag Sr. lost his son in the Suicide Squad movie because Amanda Waller says when he died in Corto Maltese, he died a hero. And of course, there was that infamous scene of him being killed by Peacemaker. And he says, Peacemaker, what a joke. Oh, I was so mad at Peacemaker after this. I almost didn't want to watch his series. I was so mad at him. But yeah, it's a fantastic series. If you haven't seen season 1, you got to watch it. It's awesome. Anyway, then we learn that Rick Flag Sr. lost his son 2 years back. He says he passed on about 2 years back. So that's very helpful. And then Economos references the events of Peacemaker Season 1 when he's asked, what happened to your leg? And he says, well, I was fighting off an alien invasion. Of course, that's when he broke his leg in Peacemaker. And then speaking of getting injured, Clayface goes all Bane on Rick Flag Sr. and breaks his back. Oh my gosh, that scene was so hard to watch. And of course, by the end of Creature Commandos, Rick Flag Sr. is in bad shape. All right, so what do we learn about Creature Commandos? Well, it's about 2 years after the Suicide Squad. Economos still has his cane. Dude takes a long time to heal up. And Rick Flag's back is broken as well as several other injuries. Okay, so now finally, on to Superman. What do we learn about the timing for this movie? Well, first of all, we get this helpful quote from James Gunn. He says that Rick Flag Sr. is in both Superman and Peacemaker Season 2, so that's awesome. But also, he tells us that Creature Commandos happens only months before Superman. Oh, wow. Now that is very helpful information. And obviously, Rick Flag does appear in the Superman movie and doesn't look very injured anymore. So we can put a couple other facts in here. We know it's only months after Creature Commandos, and Rick Flag's back is healed. Okay, so now let's talk about the timeline for Superman. So James Gunn was quoted as saying, we're introducing a whole new world, which is a lot of fun. We're in an alternate reality where superheroes have existed for 300 years, and now we're just picking up on the story of one particular superhero 3 years after he comes on the scene, who happens to be the most powerful metahuman of all time. Now, that's important. That means Superman came on the scene and then 3 years later, the Superman movie happens. Well, I did a video on the book Superman Welcome to Metropolis, so you can check that out if you want more details, but this tells the story of his first appearance. So that means this book is happening 3 years before the movie. And one of the most interesting things in the book is Lex Luthor discovers kryptonite injures Superman because he creates Metallo, one of Superman's villains in the comics, and he powers him with this ore or mineral that's extremely rare and previously unknown to science but was discovered by his experts. And sure enough, the thing is a source of tremendous power, and he uses it to power Metallo. But what really excites Luthor is, sure, it powers Metallo, but more importantly, it weakens Superman, and he ends up with a sample of kryptonite at the end of the book. So yeah, 3 years before the movie, Lex actually has in his possession kryptonite, but somehow he manages to lose it by the time of the movie because obviously he has to use Metamorpho to create kryptonite. Okay, so one more thing I want to talk about that happens before the movie itself. Now, this is a scene from the movie, but notice on the far left, there's a framed newspaper. Clearly, we can't read it, right? But thanks to Fox Ate My Sushi, I got a copy of that newspaper because Fox worked on set and took this really clear picture of the newspaper. So what's interesting is it has a Tuesday, September 7th date, which aligns to calendar year 2021. Now, I don't think it could possibly be 2021 because, remember, Superman's only been around for 3 years, and this would be longer than 3 years. But whether or not this date is accurate, I think the event still occurs. Superman stops MTA Rail from running off the tracks. Now, why do I say that? Well, actually, in the Superman movie, we see an advertisement for MTA Rail. So that's pretty cool. And in fact, when we look at the newspaper article itself, we see him stopping this runaway train, which kind of reminds me of the first Superman movie where he helped to stop another runaway train, right? So it's written by Clark Kent and, of course, photos by Jimmy Olsen. And the most important thing in the newspaper is when it says the train was stopped by the city's most famous superhero. So assuming this truly is canon, then that means sometime after that novel, but before the movie, this train was saved by Superman. Okay, now, finally, let's talk about what we learned in the movie itself. So you might remember at the beginning of the movie, we get all these graphics telling us things like 3 centuries ago, the first superpowered beings known as metahumans appeared on the Earth, ushering in a new era of gods and monsters. And of course, that's the name of the first phase of Gunn's new DCU. And then in a second graphic, we're told that 3 decades ago, an extraterrestrial baby was sent in a spacecraft to Earth and adopted by Kansas farmers. So I'm just going to summarize all of them together here. 3 centuries ago, first metahumans appeared on Earth. 3 decades ago, Kal-El arrives on Earth. 3 years ago, Superman made his debut. 3 weeks ago, Superman stopped an invasion. And 3 minutes ago, Superman lost his first battle. And then actually, we can add to that, 3 months ago, Lois and Clark started dating, because we learned that in the movie as well. So 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Okay, so let's talk about the high-level scene order. If you watched any of my trailer breakdowns, you know I broke it into 8 key scene groupings. So we're going to talk about when each of these happen within the movie. And in fact, we can say that the one in the upper left-hand corner, where Superman stops the initial invasion, that was 3 weeks ago. But what month and what year? That's what I really want to know as we look at the rest of these. So, if you go to the Daily Planet on Instagram, they are posting what seem to be official information about the movie. And notice here they give us a date of July of 2025. Okay, so maybe that's when it's happening, right? July of 2025. In fact, Rachel Brosnahan herself in an interview said, this is a Superman film that takes place today. Well, that would imply July of 2025. But I want to know whether the movie itself gives us a firm date. So, in the movie, you might remember, Clark is carrying this newspaper around, and in all my trailer breakdowns, I was trying to read what it says. I mean, obviously, we can see Hammer of Baravia, so it's the day after that attack, but the date is blurry. Well, I did end up getting a very clear shot of it from, once again, Fox Ate My Sushi, so thank you, Fox. And notice the date is Monday, May 19th, and that perfectly aligns to 2025, because May 19th is a Monday in 2025. And even more importantly, this newspaper shows up in the movie with a clear shot. I mean, like a close-up of it. So yeah, it is most definitely May of 2025 when this movie's occurring. And in fact, in the newspaper article itself, it says, Metropolis was targeted by a superpowered mystery man on Sunday, meaning the Hammer of Baravia attacked on Sunday, and on Monday, Clark wrote about the story. Okay, so also in the movie, we see Hawkgirl holding this newspaper that says U.S. defies Geneva Convention by holding Superman in pocket universe. So this is the day after he's arrested. And they actually give us a real nice close-up of the newspaper, and we can see that it's in May and it's on a Thursday. And then thankfully, I do have a screenshot from the movie that shows us the final newspaper, and in fact, that was on Saturday, May 24th. So remember, the first newspaper we saw was Monday, May 19th, and then it goes to Saturday, May 24th. And actually, because that newspaper is reporting on the Hammer's attack on Sunday, that means the movie goes from Sunday to Saturday. It's a full week in Superman's life. I love it. Okay, so now let's fill in some more of these blanks here. That means the initial attack by the Hammer is on Sunday, and then Superman goes back and gets healed, and then goes back and tries to finish things off with the Hammer before, of course, he flies away. So then he writes his story about the attack for the next day, and of course he has the interview that night, so that's all happening Monday night. Now, I think the baby kaiju was released into Metropolis Monday night because the kaiju attack would therefore be on Tuesday. And then we see Superman talking to Lois Tuesday night, trying to decide what to do because he knows that Lex has kidnapped Krypto, so decides he's going to turn himself in the next day. Therefore, he's arrested on Wednesday. Then we saw that newspaper that tells us Thursday he's still being held. So they're writing the newspaper article the next day. So that means Thursday he's in the prison, and that's when he escapes. When he escapes, he goes home and spends the night with the Kents. So then he finally returns to action for that boss battle with Ultraman and the Engineer on Friday. And then, of course, we saw that final newspaper article, which had a date of Saturday. So yeah, this is really, really cool. I love how Gunn did such a nice, tight timeline for the movie. Okay, so let's fill in the last bit of information we got, which is that there is a May 2025 newspaper in the movie. So let's try to put some tentative dates here. I mean, Superman, we know, that is May of 2025. So Creature Commando was only a few months earlier, so I'm just going to put February of 2025. We don't know for sure, but I'm just trying to get something on here to work with. Okay, so then we know the Suicide Squad was about 2 years before Creature Commandos. So I'm just going to go with May of 2023 for now, which is really wild. That means in the DCU, this movie happened a lot later in the timeline than it did in the original DCEU. And then lastly, we know that the Peacemaker series is 5 months after the Suicide Squad, so I'm just going to go with October of 2023. So what's crazy about this is that means Economos, after a year and a half, still has his broken leg and is using a cane, but after only 3 or so months, Rick Flag has recovered from a broken back and all those other crazy injuries. So he clearly has a better metabolism for healing than Economos. So anyway, these are just rough dates to get something down, and we'll have to hope that we get more information and more clarity as the DCU continues along. So, let me know your thoughts. What do you think about the timeline? Do you like how James Gunn is managing it? Do you think I got anything right or wrong? I love to hear your feedback. I read and respond to everything. So don't forget, July contest, be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook. And there's the membership option in case you're interested in that. And then I always love to mention the Discord. Here we are talking about the release of Superman. And yes, I'm sure that timeline section is going to be hopping in the days to come. Plus, I also promised I'd talk about the Doomsday Countdown Watch on the Discord, so at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard on every day listed here, we'll watch a different movie or show as we prepare for the December 18th, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,200 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all eagerly await the next entry in the DCU.